This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour.
It just shows how long we've had that cultural rot, and it does show kind of this delayed adolescence as well.
Our culture is in trouble. Amanda Prestigiacomo of the Daily Wire explains what everyone's missing about the Las Vegas shooting.
We don't know what Hugh Hefner's soul was like when he went to go meet his reward. We just don't know.
It's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it. Praying for Hugh Hefner's soul with Nate Madden of CRTV.
How are you okay with the fact that more black babies are aborted than born alive? How are you okay with that? And to hear nothing but silence.
The Black Civil Rights Movement has been hijacked. Pro-life activist Ryan Bomberger explains.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, where future popes and presidents get their start. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid.
Now, I love my wife just as much as any man, but that doesn't mean that I should stand for a lot of folderol. By gad, I won't stand for it. That's the one thing I shall not submit myself to.
Joining me now is Amanda Prestigiacomo, staff writer for the Daily Wire, who is doing some really tremendous coverage of the horrible shooting this week in Las Vegas. First of all, great job on your reportage, Amanda. You must have worked overtime on that.
Yeah, it was coming in real fast. Tons of updates, a lot of reports, but it was important to get that stuff out there. Really, really sad, devastating news.
Yeah, well, I thought the White House handled it in a very genteel way. I liked especially Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She sort of dismissed out of hand the disgusting maniac who actually killed all of these people and gave a beautiful litany of praise to the people who instinctively acted so heroically in the context of the shooting.
Yeah, exactly. And from Huckabee Sanders and from Donald Trump as well, there was no politicization of this. It was comforting the country and paying homage to those heroes. So it was very refreshing to have President Trump in office, and then you see Hillary Clinton going off on her Twitter account and exploiting this tragedy and calling out the NRA by name, and it's just kind of like, okay, my vote did make sense.
Well, let's not politicize things immediately afterwards. By the way, here's my politics, and if you don't assent to it, it's because you're kind of pro-mass murder. That was the feeling.
In one tweet, she said, "Let's not politicize this tragedy." Can you imagine if the NRA, blah, blah, it was insane. It was insanity.
But enough about Hillary. I think our nation needs to fast from Hillary's Twitter account.
Agree.
In fact, actually, maybe all at once we can have National Block Hillary Day, and everyone can just block the
It would do a lot of good for the country.
It would, yes. Just a Hillary blackout. But But so one of the things that came to my mind right away, Huckabee Sanders did a good job of not emphasizing the man who shot these people, the aggressor himself, and she focused on all these heroic people in the crowd. Tremendous examples. One was amazing, this husband who shielded his wife from gunfire and was killed himself. Other examples, there were several police officers, both on-duty and off-duty cops, who died just using their bodies as shields. It is so moving. And again, 3 cheers and a drink for toxic masculinity.
Exactly. I mean, we see this all the time during destruction or massacres or, terrible incidents like this. We see that dreaded toxic masculinity that feminists are trying to, rip from our culture come through and save children and women and other men, and they just step up and help Americans. And we've seen that through the hurricanes. We've seen this through this disaster as well.
Yeah, so I think that a factor here that a lot of people are missing, they're not talking about, is just the cultural decay that allows for this kind of thing to happen. One of the few things we do know about the shooter is that he had an absentee father. He and his brother come from a broken home. They have a cultureless background.
That's exactly right. And if you look at study upon study, Ben Shapiro, my boss at Daily Wire, says this all the time, the greatest privilege in America is having 2 parents in the household. Children with one parent, fatherless homes, they're going to do worse in school. They're going to be more prone to crime. They're going to be more prone to poverty. Every study has borne this out. And a lot of people want to rip the right for, holding strong to these traditional values and having traditional marriage and, marrying young and not having sex until you're married and then having kids and having that nuclear family. But you see such good results from that. And when that doesn't happen, when you have a child who's brought up in a fatherless home, in a broken home, and you see them look for answers or something to fill that void, and it's usually something not very good. And again, this person had no religious structure, according to his brother, and nothing religious going on in his life. So that leads a very big void that can be filled by something very bad, like gambling or drugs or what have you. And that can lead to a very destructive culture and more crime, and we see all the time.
You know, the guy's age kind of strikes me too, right? This is not a teenager.
Right.
And we're kind of used to this sort of school shootings, young deranged people, by the way, all of whom, like Adam Lanza, come from messed up homes. A lot of them don't have fathers. But it's sad because this guy reminds me of how long our culture has been going downhill, right? The guy's 64-year-old, and his brother is describing, oh, yeah, our father was a criminal, and we don't really know him.
Yeah.
It's been that long.
That's exactly right. Someone just brought that up to me this morning, and they were like, the shooter who took shots on the baseball field that hurt Scalise, he was 66. So like you said, it is very strange. That's a great point you made. Typically, we're used to these young kids, but now we're seeing people who are retired, 66, 64 years old, acting out in these childish ways. Yeah, it just shows how long we've had that cultural rot, and it does show kind of this delayed adolescence as well, where you're not married and structured. It's just kind of you're always a perpetual child.
Right. What are the solutions to that? What are the factors that solve that, that make people grow up and make people, for instance, dive on top of strangers' children in a hail of gunfire at a concert rather than be the unman that took out a gun and just shot strangers? What is the difference between those two?
And then in a cowardice move, killed himself. Well, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, universities are killing us. They are delaying adolescence for sure. I mean, that's where they learn about their safe spaces and their trigger warnings. And they're always these perpetual children. They're becoming even more victimized. My dad says this all the time. That's why I was initially a teacher. We need to have conservatives get into teaching, get into academia. We need to kind of infiltrate that institution because that does have a really profound effect on children and then eventually young adults and adults. So that's a huge thing we can do. And then there are some younger millennials who are speaking out and making this counterculture, this Christian culture, making that culture cool again. I know that's hard to do, but we're seeing it. I know Matt Walsh does it, Ben Shapiro. There are a lot of good conservatives who are bringing up this counterculture.
Yeah.
And that's also a huge thing we can do to try to perpetuate these traditional values because as we've seen, that's what bears the most fruit.
By the way, I'm a millennial. You're a millennial, barely. You're younger than I am. But almost all of the guests on this show are younger than I am. And I'm only, 29. So I do feel kind of proud like we're part of that wave of counterculture where you're saying, well, this isn't working, everybody.
Yeah.
Or you're just saying, no, we completely reject. Just stop it. We have our own thing going on.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned about coolness is true for everyone except for Ben. He's not cool at all. But it is true. I think that there's this wave that I can see growing of people who don't even think it's not cool anymore to be for this unmanning of society.
Yeah, and that can lead to some bad fringy stuff like the meninists or like male feminists or whatever. That can lead to some fringy stuff, some bad counterculture, or it can lead to something really good, this middle ground where they're promoting these traditional values as cool. And again, that is important. It seems silly, but that is very important. So we have to be careful.
It's the weirdest thing I even encounter online. I encounter really edgy, smart, pundit-ish housewives who are completely just killing it online and they're doing, and it's kind of cool because they're like housewives with kids, and they're the coolest thing in school.
Yeah, that's so true. And thank goodness for all the pitfalls we had from it. Thank goodness for the internet. Thank goodness for YouTube. Thank goodness for these platforms where people outside of the mainstream media can kind of voice their opinion because we are in the silent majority. So we just have to keep coming out and advocating for traditional values and Judeo-Christian values.
Or else. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to just bully all of my male friends that strike me as softening because otherwise they're going to, probably going to shoot everyone.
Bully them until they man up. And then you can show them how important that is.
Right. Otherwise, they're a ticking time bomb. Who knows what they'll do?
Right. Yeah, you're doing them a favor.
All right. Well, thank you,
Bully
Amanda.
because you care.
Yeah, I bully because I care. That's right. I care, so I bully. This is healthy stuff. And I was bullied as well, and it always helped me out.
Yeah, same.
All right, well, thanks again for being with us, Amanda, and we'll have you on again soon. I want to encourage our listeners, as always, to follow Amanda on Twitter and also follow her work at the Daily Wire. You can find her online at Amanda Presto.
Yes.
And we will talk to you again soon, Amanda. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'm not gonna get home.
And talking with me now is CRTV's congressional correspondent Nate Madden, who has some very moving thoughts about the passing of the late Hugh Hefner, the legacy he left behind, and what the heck we're supposed to do about that. Isn't that right, Nate?
I hope they're moving.
Yeah, well, I was moved. It wasn't the first thought that I had, and I've got to be honest with you. You must be more in touch with your gentle side, because a lot of columns came out about Hefner that were basically like, I want to beat the next guy to be the first to spit on his grave. But you had some interesting thoughts because you were saying, well, after all, he did have a soul.
Right.
And Catholics, we pray for the souls of the departed, that they make it.
Exactly. That was my starting point there. You know, as a convert myself, I did my first confession when I went through confirmation. There were things that I'm forever grateful that God's forgiven me for. And I worry about those who have never found that light, who've never found that grace, who've never found that sort of redemption. And we don't know the state of Hugh Hefner's soul. But just like him, just like any other sinner that we would pray for, just like anybody else who would have died outside the light of truth, I wrote that we should pray. And it came from a conversation that I had with some friends of mine. My wife and I were having dinner with them out in Adams Morgan at this little Italian place. We got to talking about memento mori art and praying for the dead. And don't ask me how we got there in the conversation. It's one of those that winds and ends up there. But the husband, it was a couple friend, the husband said to me, I always make a point of praying for people who weren't Catholic when they died and whose families weren't Catholic. Because when you think about it,
right,
who in the world is specifically praying for that soul? And as I kind of ruminated on that, there's no amending what Hugh Hefner's life legacy was. There's no amending and there's no sugarcoating, despite the attempts of the mainstream media, what this guy did, what he stood for, and what he did. He was a dirty old pornographer in his life. That was his contribution to society.
Right.
He was pro-abortion. He was very pro-pornography, obviously. And he left a very long trail of destruction on the American family, on people's souls by mainstreaming this sort of smut. We can make absolutely no bones about what he did in life, but what we can't say is anything about the state of his soul as he passed.
Right. You know what's interesting to me, reflecting on your article, which, by the way, folks, you can find it at CatholicVote.org. Nate is a columnist at Catholic Vote, and this was his latest contribution just this week. But I was reflecting on it. One of the things that I was thinking to myself was, I think in terms of stopping people from doing harm like he did, but it's almost like by dint of the same impulse I have to attack him and to stop people like him, I should also do what you suggest, which is pray for the souls of those who are harmed themselves.
Oh, definitely.
And who are harmful themselves.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, as we're talking about this right now, I think back to C.S. Lewis, and he's got this essay. It's an addendum to the Screwtape Letters, where the demon proposing a toast in this, Uncle Screwtape, he says, we don't get the kind of horrid people that we used to. What we get is just a steady supply of people who have committed these other sins of modernity. You don't end up with the same kinds of tyrants and mass murderers in the same kind of quantity, but you end up with a steady stream of sinners. And those are the kinds of people that we need to pray for in life and pray for in death, because we know these people have souls. These people bear the image of God. They're our brothers and sisters in Christ. And it's our duty to perform the spiritual work of mercy, of praying for the living and the dead in the hope that all can be reunited with God in the afterlife.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Actually, maybe part of why you got this insight, Nate, is that, in full disclosure to the audience, I've known Nate for a number of years and I met you a while back. But when I first met you at the John Jay Institute, you were dressed all in black. And the other thing that I remember is that a number of years later, I remember you sharing that you keep a skull or a facsimile thereof on your desk as a memento mori. You mentioned memento mori art. I mean, are you just a sicko, or do you recommend focus on death and remembering death? Do you think that might have been what brought you that insight? Is this sort of constant in your character, is that you are, in a way that I think is healthy, you focus on some darkness a little?
Well, I do, and if that goes back before my conversion, my favorite song by Johnny Cash is Man in Black, and I guess I kind of just appropriated that, and I've kind of kept it going. Even now, you'll ask anybody that I work with, I usually roll into the office wearing, black on black, and I wear a scapular of Our Lady of Sorrows, and it's a charism that I have in my personal life to pray for the suffering of others, pray to try to take some of that off of them, and to pray for those, especially there's that line in Man in Black that Johnny Cash talks about, for those who've never heard or read or listened to the words that Jesus said, But I think about this amazing gift that I've been given in my conversion to Catholicism and this amazing grace that we all have access to, and it's my sincerest hope and my prayers that I can help other people spiritually kind of find that through prayer for them.
Right.
In my article, I say that we don't know what Hugh Hefner's soul was like when he went to go meet his reward. We just don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know of anybody's soul, whether, like I said, whether they died in the odor of sanctity or at the bottom of a filthy, immoral cesspool like Hefner did in the Playboy Mansion, right? But we pray.
Right.
We pray because we can't comprehend the extent of that mercy or how perfectly balanced with justice it is with God.
Right.
And so we've been given these simple instructions. Pray for the living and for the dead.
See, now, I've got to tell you, to be perfectly honest, it's off-putting to me, just because of my personal character and my own proclivities. I don't know if I want to pray. I mean, Hugh Hefner, really, do we want to talk about? But then on the other hand, I'm thinking, you know what? I think it's completely compatible with and not contradictory to being a bold confronter of evil and a cultural warrior. So, for instance, I can be an attacker of the filth that our culture is awash in, greatly thanks to Hefner. And if he were still alive and I was in a position to do so, I could directly confront him and I could fight him and I could see him as my cultural enemy and my political enemy in all these different ways. He was a big proponent of abortion, of using women and then killing their offspring essentially so that they remain useful as sex objects. And I can oppose all of that, and ultimately it's because I don't want souls to be damaged. I don't want people to lose their character. I don't want them to lose their chances at salvation.
Exactly. That's why we're in this. Everything that we do as Christians, everything that we do as Catholics, those of us in public life, those of us out in the public square, we're not just trying to do this for our own health and for just for kicks and giggles. We're fighting these things out in society because we know that they're damaging to people's salvation. We know that they're damaging to people's souls.
Right.
This is why we're in it.
Right.
Ultimately, the goal is salvation, man.
What's interesting, too, what do you think of, you can draw a direct line from Hefner's mission in life to the breakdown of people's motivation to be upright, to provide for their families, to be even good at their jobs. Ultimately, a lot of the social ills we see right now, like fatherless families, people who are stuck in a rut and never rise out of poverty. I think a lot of that could be linked to what he did, don't you think?
Oh, totally. This is why, as Catholics, we talk about this concept of human ecology, right? That ecosystem of how we're supposed to live together and live in relation to the natural law or live in relation to divine revelation. All of these things touch each other, and you can't pour pollution into one part of an ecosystem without it radiating out and affecting every other organism in that ecosystem. So yeah, the sexual revolutionary that Hugh Hefner was, that was the kind of pollution that affected all parts of the human ecosystem. It affected the family, and of course it affected human life. It affects the economy because of course you don't have the right family relations that lead to functioning economies, which naturally leads to poverty. It's exactly what you're describing. You can't dump hazardous waste into one part of anything, forest, swamp, whatever you want to call it, without hurting everything in there, man.
That's interesting. So note to young men, you're ultimately hurting us, dudes.
Exactly.
In other words, if you degrade women, it doesn't do any favors for the guys.
Oh, no, no.
So I want to recommend listeners follow your work. You can be found on CRTV and Conservative Review. You can find him also on Twitter at Nate Madden CRTV. And we'll have you on again very soon.
All right, thank you, brother. I really appreciate it. Take care of yourself.
All right, God bless. Well, we've come to that time for our weekly political discussion with Catholic Vote Political Director Josh Mercer. Josh, you're in Pennsylvania now speaking with voters, and you have some very interesting thoughts about some Catholic yet pro-abortion senators that we can keep an eye out for, right?
Yeah, next year there's a big Senate race here in Pennsylvania, and I'm just out here talking with Catholic voters about the important issues that are going on. Bob Casey Jr., we talked about this a few weeks ago. He's a United States Senator here from Pennsylvania. His dad was really pro-life, but he's totally pro-abortion. He'll cast a few votes our way, but when it comes to providing funding for Planned Parenthood, he is Planned Parenthood's biggest friend. And as you know, they're the number one provider of abortions in the country. So he tries to talk the pro-life game, but he did that in the past, like in 2006. And now he's pretty blatant about trying to court the support of Planned Parenthood and making sure that they get our tax money to continue on with their abortion business.
Right. And to quote our first featured guest, Jason Jones, he describes some people as totally reliable except when it counts.
Right. No, and Bob Casey Jr. is totally that. And we're here in West Mercer, Pennsylvania, which is a very traditional Catholic Democratic area. We're just talking with voters, and these are some of the same voters who in 2016 decided to try to take another look at it and see maybe there's a different way of trying things and vote for candidates that were more in line with their values, because the Democratic Party, they felt, drifted over the years further and further to the left, not just on abortion, which was pretty obvious, but then on marriage, and then also just on the role of religion in society. And it seems like a hostility to Christianity, rather than, it's one thing the Democrats try to say, oh, separation of church and state and leave that on Sunday. And, now it seems like they're the ones that want to talk about religion all the time in a way that's very disapproving. So
yeah, there's a lot of Catholic ex-Democrats in Pennsylvania, aren't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And, I'm only about 40 miles from the West Virginia border, and the senator there is also running for re-election next year. He's a Democrat, Joe Manchin. He's Catholic, too. Again, casts a few votes for pro-life legislation. We like that, of course. But then when it comes to funding Planned Parenthood, he lines up and makes sure they get taxpayer funding. So, like you say, when push comes to shove, when you really need them, they just disappoint you. So
yeah, it's amazing. And these are Catholic leaders. I mean, what is the future of these people? And actually, what are some other names? Senators. These are Catholics who are pro-abortion during a time when, after the scandals exposed by David Daleiden and the Center for Medical Progress, it seems like there's a growing popular demand to defund Planned Parenthood, and these Catholic senators are on the wrong side of that.
Right. I mean, there's 5 Catholics in the Senate who are Democrats that are all up for re-election next year. Right here in Pennsylvania, like I said, Casey, then just across the border there in West Virginia, Joe Manchin. In Missouri, Claire McCaskill, she's Catholic Democrat. She's pro-abortion from head to toe. Absolutely terrible. And Missouri is a state that's getting to be more conservative, more pro-life every year.
Right.
And then over in North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp, she got endorsed by NARAL and all the other rabid pro-abortion groups.
Right.
And now she's trying to backpedal a little bit, and she voted to end the debate on the filibuster. She was, let's let Gorsuch have a vote. Well, that was nice that she did that, and she voted for that. But 99% of the time, she's casting a vote for Planned Parenthood. And we've made this point so many times before. Right now, this gun control debate is starting to heat up, and people on the left are saying, well, the NRA, they spend so much money on elections. The story of the NRA is like voters, not really their money. If you want to talk about influence of money on elections, Planned Parenthood dwarfs the NRA when it comes to donations.
Yeah,
they
I think
give money to so many candidates.
Yeah. Last year, Planned Parenthood spent more money in 1 year in terms of giving money to politicians than the NRA spent in the last decade, I believe.
Absolutely. I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, Planned Parenthood is a business. They make a lot of money from this despicable act of abortion, and they make sure they provide the checks to it. So Planned Parenthood says, we don't like these pro-life votes that some of these senators from conservative states cast, but at least when push comes to shove, they'll make sure that they back these $100 million checks that the government sends every year. So
right.
Catholic voters in Pennsylvania, in West Virginia, in Missouri, in North Dakota, they're going to have a lot of things to look at and examine. And a lot of times what we're going to face is not just a pro-abortion Catholic, but in many cases they're going to be a pro-life Catholic. There's a lot of pro-life Catholics that are trying to run for these seats. So you might get a showdown between 2 Catholics, one who's pro-abortion and casting all these votes for Planned Parenthood in the United States Senate, and a challenger who's pro-life and wants to take him out. So
wow.
That could be the real election story from 2018.
It's amazing how,
a lot of these states.
It's amazing how much Catholicism has to do with mainstream politics.
Well, I mean, certainly 22% or whatever of the U.S. population is Catholic, and in certain states, like Pennsylvania, that's even higher. So it's of course natural that elected officials from these states are Catholic. Then the question just is, well, what kind of Catholic are they?
Right.
Are they the kind of Catholic that is sort of ashamed of their faith and puts it away in a corner? And then anytime we want to talk about protecting children, and they say, well, I don't want to force my religious views on anyone. Look, we're not asking you to pass a law to make everyone go to church on Sunday, okay? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about protecting children in the womb.
Right.
And are you going to give hundreds of millions of dollars of our tax money to abortion giant Planned Parenthood?
Right.
And we keep...
It's also funny how they're like, I don't want to impose my faith on anyone when it comes to saving hundreds of thousands of unborn lives a year, because it would be wrong for me to impose my faith on someone. And then they turn around and often say, but you have to accept this list of Democratic Party positions because Jesus says so. In other words, you're not a real Christian if you don't support, open borders or, the $15 minimum wage or any number of other things, or the welfare state. You're not a real Christian unless you support these Democratic Party policies. And then meanwhile, I don't want to impose my faith. That would be wrong. You're a bigot if you impose your faith with regard to abortion.
Right. So let's have one standard here. should we ask, what could our Christian principles, can they guide them? Can they enlighten them? Now, in the Catholic tradition, we would say ultimately we want to have a foundation of natural law so that even if you're Muslim or Lutheran or, whatever the case may be, atheist even,
right,
that these laws could be applicable because they're grounded in principles that all of us share.
Right.
And that's what's great about it.
Yeah, I used to move in sort of Northeastern Catholic intellectual circles for a while, and one of the things that they often...
Have you recovered yet?
I'm still recovering. At least I've quit smoking. No,
there you go.
But they would often describe our culture as a post-Christian culture. They would wail and gnash their teeth. We are now on the outs. We're a post-Christian culture. Oh, it's irretrievable. There's nothing we can do about it. And then meanwhile, they were kind of fideists, and there was a tendency to sort of separate our faith from natural law and from public rhetoric and reasoning that could be appealing to others.
Right. That's
and
horrible.
I said, well, this is a problem because, I should...
That's the bridge.
That's
the
exactly
bridge you need to use.
Exactly. And I said, well, I should hope that you can appeal to reason and natural law, especially if you think that this is a post-Christian culture. If it's to be a post-Christian culture, I still want to save innocents in that culture. Even if they don't accept my faith, I hope I can reason with them.
Now, I agree with what you're saying. Look, I lived in the Northeast for a while too, and in many ways it did feel like a post-Christian area. It was, on paper, it's like 50, 60, 70% Catholic, but it did not feel like a vibrant Catholic society by any means. And there needs to be a revival or a rebirth there. But the thing we always try to stress at Catholic Vote is that there's still a dialect. There's still a culture.
Right.
Catholicism is deep and it has hooks to it. Just like Judaism. Judaism and Catholicism, more than any other faith tradition. I understand what they mean by post-Christian, but there is the language. There are the things around us. You never know what'll bring people back, but you can try to bring them back. And just meeting with voters here, there is that common bond and common heritage, and you're not throwing a Bible at their forehead. That doesn't work. But if you can try to say, what do we share in common? What kind of things do we understand together? And there's
Amen.
that, like I say, that Catholic dialect.
Yep.
That can be picked up on.
There's no generation of the human race that is born without the natural law written within their hearts. That's the great thing about our faith. It's such an encouragement.
And
it's reverent
and
of human
Catholicism
nature.
rhymes with that so well, doesn't it?
Yeah, Catholicism rhymes with that. Yep, amen. Reagan says freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Well, the optimistic other side of that coin is that the human race or any individual is never far from salvation. It's always possible to communicate the truth.
Well, right. And wouldn't that be the case that a renewal of our country is only one generation away as well? The reverse could be true, too.
Amen. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, it's been a really uplifting conversation with you, Josh. Thanks so much, Josh. I can't wait to talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Stephen.
And now I can love and be loved, all because of you. I know I was meant to be.
And now I'm sitting down with Ryan Bomberger, who is a hero of mine and a great inspiration in the pro-life movement. He is the co-founder and chief creative officer of the Radiance Foundation and does some great work there. What we were just listening to was also the sound of Ryan singing a song that he wrote himself. Ryan, can you tell me about that song?
Sure. As someone who was conceived in rape, trying to figure out a way to honor my birth mom, words just seem insufficient, but I still tried anyway. So I wrote the song to try to figure out how do I even thank a woman who showed such courage, who went through 9 months of traumatic pregnancy and yet still gave me life, still gave me the gift of adoption and set forth in motion things that she never could have even imagined. And so I wrote the song Meant to Be, and it's a tribute. It's a tribute to a woman who chose to be stronger than her circumstances. And it's my way of just expressing what I think is inadequate, but expressing this gratitude for giving me life and making a singular decision that literally will have reverberations for generations.
Wow. And now how old was she when she this is horrible that she was raped.
Yeah, the information that I get from the adoption agency is a little scant, but that was one of the things that they did give me, that she was 19 when she had me. She was estranged from her own family. She was a foster child herself who unfortunately just had a rough situation with her own parents and didn't have a healthy relationship. And so I don't know much more than that. I do know that she was very young, going through such a horrific experience And she had the opportunity. She was in the military, actually. And it was during that time that she could have gotten an abortion through the military because of what they called therapeutic abortion, which isn't it crazy how we put certain words together?
It is. Wow.
So she could have, of course, gotten abortion based on rape and incest that a lot of states still allowed even before Roe v. Wade, but she still chose life. So I believe that someone had to have encouraged her. Someone had to have spoken life to her for her to hold on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now that's what you do, speak life to people. With your music, though, I'm wondering, what did you, early on in your career or even before your career, what did you foresee yourself doing? Did you primarily have an interest in music and pursuing a musical career at first, or?
No, that's just kind of a side thing. You know, I'm a creative professional, and I feel like God has given me these talents and abilities. And all my life, I loved creating things. I love, the design, typography. As a kid, I loved creating my own fonts, and that turned into, I was always the one doing the school posters for events, in middle school and high school. And then when computers and graphics sort of merged and you could create stuff that way, Photoshop and everything Adobe became my best friend. But I love the creative aspect and was always encouraged to pursue the things that were in me. My parents were incredibly supportive of all 13 kids, by the way. I had 9 adopted siblings and 3 who were biological. So we grew up in a really big home, but sports were actually bigger than the creative part. And I gave up music. I gave up piano and saxophone to play football. And then I got 2 shattered legs through football. So yeah, that really worked out well. But I was encouraged to kind of pursue the things that I felt were in me. And I always loved being creative. I always loved the challenge of putting words together and giving meaning to those things. And now I love doing it as the Chief Creative Officer of the Radiance Foundation.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because putting words together, you are a wordsmith and you're also very good at visual art. And to tell you the truth, I don't know if you knew this, but this is how I discovered you. I came across a Radiance Foundation video, and it was very, very brief, no spoken words in it, but it was a very stunning visual. And it basically did something very clever. It said, this is the number of unarmed black Americans who have been killed by police brutality this year. And you contrasted that with the number of unarmed black Americans that have been killed by abortion that same year. And the numbers did not even compare. And you did it very well visually, but also that's a play on words, isn't it? An unarmed black American. No one normally thinks of an unborn child.
They're very unarmed. They're unarmed black lives. And you're talking about one of our the Field of Freedom spot where, I hear all the time about people talking about, we see it all the time through social media and on the news, Black Lives Matter. Well, I'm a firm believer that Black lives matter in and out of the womb, that all lives matter in and out of the womb because we're created in the image of God. And to actually provide that contrast, especially when the Black Lives Matter movement, these leaders have partnered with the abortion industry. They announced their solidarity with them. So creating that, I think it's like a 15 or 20-second spot to just try to highlight that hypocrisy and to put things into context. But that's what I love to do.
Yeah, and it was funny, actually. So as a black man, it's interesting that you spend a lot of your time confronting a lot of black civil rights or so-called black civil rights leaders. It's interesting to me because most of the time people would not associate black civil rights activism with the pro-life movement, and that's very unfortunate. Why do you think that is?
Well, because the civil rights movement has been hijacked. I mean, it's so clear. I mean, those like the NAACP that were created out of the discrimination and the deaths caused, the lynchings of blacks, actually the lynchings of blacks and whites, but it was created to protect the most disenfranchised, the most vulnerable. And there are amazing milestones, of course, by the NAACP, but somewhere along that path, especially in the 60s, they veered off sharply. And now they actually partner with, and many other so-called civil rights groups, particularly black-led civil rights groups like the Urban League, they actually partner with the leading killer of unarmed black lives. And I couldn't understand that, and we even went through this insane lawsuit with the NAACP that sued me and sued the Radiance Foundation for calling them out, for calling out the radical pro-abortion position by calling them the National Association for the Abortion of Colored People.
Wow.
And 2 years after, federal lawsuits and losing initially in the U.S. District Court in Norfolk, we lost initially, but then won at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. But then I realized in such a painful and tangible way that civil rights have truly gone wrong.
You basically present the abortion issue as the leading civil rights issue of our time, do you not?
I do. I mean, what group of human beings is more targeted with death, more targeted with discrimination than the unborn?
Right.
And you would think of someone with brown skin would better understand that, which is what, you remember that whole interview with Rick Santorum years ago where he had made the remark about how President Obama should even better understand that reality because he is brown, because of a group of human beings, black people, being deemed less than human. Why wasn't he championing the rights of the unborn? He was just demonized
Savaged.
up and down for daring to suggest that someone who was black would probably be a little more empathetic about the plight of another group of human beings targeted with discrimination and death. But unfortunately, President Obama turned out to be one of the most radical pro-abortion presidents in history.
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, you treat abortion as the leading civil rights issue of our time, but that's not just because of a protection of the unborn. Isn't it also true that blacks are disproportionately affected by the abortion industry?
Hugely. And when we started, my amazing wife, Bethany, and I, when we started the Radiance Foundation back in 2009, we were living in Atlanta at the time. And so our first foray into this whole area was to actually illuminate the hugely disproportionate impact of abortion in the black community, where abortion rates are up to 5 times higher. So we launched our TooManyAborted.com campaign to highlight this, to talk about, in New York City, where more black babies are aborted than born alive. And it was remarkable, if I could use that word, I guess, to hear the responses of liberals, of liberal organizations, of the ACLU, which denounced us for our billboards, and Planned Parenthood, of course, expectedly denounced us. But to hear some of these black civil rights leaders, how are you okay with the fact that more black babies are aborted than born alive? How are you okay with that? And to hear nothing but silence, other than them to just, from time to time, return with a response saying, oh, but it's reproductive justice. Well, where's the justice in a hugely disproportionate impact of abortion in the black community? So we decided, why don't we just take the 2 easiest subjects possible, race and abortion, and we decided to light it up. And actually, it was part of a Black History Month initiative to actually teach people history so that they could understand the present statistics. And I came to find out very quickly that there is a particular political party, I will name them, the party of slavery, Jim Crow, poll taxes, and now the party of abortion, that they will defend abortion no matter what. They want to cry racism all the time. But yet, in the one industry that kills for a living, nope, there's no racism there.
Right. So would you say in itself, as a shorthand, is abortion racist?
I mean, it's undeniably so. If you understand the American eugenics movement, you understand the incredibly racist pseudoscience of the American eugenics movement, which birthed Planned Parenthood. You can't deny. I mean, when one particular people group is disproportionately targeted, for instance, in 1939 with the Negro Project, where they targeted the black community with birth control efforts to severely reduce or eliminate the birth rate of poor blacks. Now, understand what I'm saying. I'm not talking about exterminating the black race. People often say that, but they really wanted to reduce or severely eliminate the birth rate of poor blacks, which have always been the target. It was racism and elitism, and those two things fused together formed an ugly, vile movement. And Planned Parenthood has never separated from it. I mean, they still celebrate their racist, elitist founder, Margaret Sanger, giving out the Margaret Sanger Award every year. Right. They've never denounced the DNA that created them. Faux feminists will often say, well, Planned Parenthood is nothing today like it was during Margaret Sanger's day. And I say, yeah, you're right. It is nothing like it. In fact, it was actually better in Margaret Sanger's day because they weren't killing hundreds of thousands of human beings every year. I mean, at least Margaret Sanger, as duplicitous as she was, at least she denounced abortion as evil. She called it a disgrace to civilization to have thousands of abortions.
Really?
Yeah, it's really bizarre. But that was one of her statements, that she said that it's a disgrace to civilization to have hundreds of thousands of abortions. But yet, I say she's duplicitous because she would say one thing in public and yet work behind the scenes to bring about legalized abortion not just here in the United States, but worldwide.
Ostensibly to reduce the number, right?
Right. I mean, because you have to eliminate these human beings that she said were marked when she was born. That great interview with Mike Wallace, where he asked her, does she believe in sin? And she said, one of the greatest sins is allowing children with disease to be born who are marked when they're born to hardly become human at all. I mean, you're human from the moment of conception onward, and none of us are marked when we're born. We are marked when we're conceived. We're marked with purpose by the creator of the universe and what I consider beautiful possibility. No adverse situation prevents us from becoming great. I mean, look at the Dr. Ben Carsons of the world. Look at, people like Faith Hill, who was adopted and loved, and she becomes country music superstar. I mean, there's so many people that are written off because of the perceived difficulty that they may face or that they did face. But we become greater human beings because of adversity, but Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood certainly don't understand that. So their solution to, Margaret Sanger, her solution to poverty was to eliminate the people.
Yeah.
Instead of addressing what caused the poverty, what caused the pain and misery. But for them, pain and misery is life that is unplanned.
Right. And actually that's very much alive and well now. That philosophical point, I hear it all the time as a pro-lifer, essentially people saying you are cruel because you are not willing to kill poor people.
It's crazy. And we're seeing it in Oregon, for instance, where now the taxpayers are being forced to fund abortion in the state of Oregon. You're seeing the same sort of things being passed where the excuse is always, well, the poor people they lack access to this. They don't lack access. If the Black community is disproportionately poorer than whites, which they are 3 to 4 times, depending on which state you're talking about, but yet have abortion rates up to 5 times higher than the majority population, there's no lack of access.
Now, you know what worries me?
But yet,
you mentioned earlier that Planned Parenthood wanted to reduce the birth rate via abortion and birth control in the poor Black community. What worries me now is how poor the Black community generally is in the United States. And I'm wondering, why is it? It almost looks as though they're being corralled into positions where they're most likely to be targeted by the abortion industry. What is going on there, do you think?
Well, we have to understand that all of this stems from a warped sort of mindset that some humans aren't worthy of life. And so population control efforts, which just continue to get different euphemisms, but the operative part of all that is control. It is about control. It's about control in the living situations, keeping people in situations where they are dependent upon, almighty government, for instance. And then, and that mighty government then turns around and funds to the tune of $500 million a year an organization that says, you know what? We're the savior of the Black community. We're the savior of the poor. Come to us. We'll kill your offspring. And we'll call it reproductive justice.
Right. Well, and also we will keep you poor and call that a social justice.
Right. I mean, how do you ever rise above if you're constantly depending on someone else to tell you your worth? And that whole argument of we're often told that Roe v. Wade empowered women, and empowered women. Well, actually, the poverty rate among women in 1972 was about 10% nationwide, and that's women ages 15 and older. You go fast forward however many years to I guess the last abortion statistics are from 2015. And the abortion rate during Barack Obama's presidency rose to 15.5% among that demographic. I mean, if abortion really reduced poverty, which it doesn't, material poverty, we would see evidence of that. And we don't see any evidence.